Today, we are constantly bombarded with mixed messages about climate change, from doomist headlines to industry spin. In this episode, Dr. Hannah Ritchie, the senior researcher at Our World in Data and author of Clearing the Air, her new book, joins me to cut through this noise. We explore the real drivers of climate change, the solutions that are already in play and working, and how to stay grounded in facts rather than fear. Please enjoy. For listeners who may not have heard our previous episode together and perhaps are not familiar with your work, can you remind us of your background and your qualifications and the work that you do with Our World in Data?
Yeah, so my background, my academic background is in environmental science. So I did bachelor's degree in environmental geoscience and a master's in carbon management, which is basically looking at climate change. And then a PhD. My PhD was kind of focused on this intersection of the environmental impacts of food systems and then partly the nutritional aspects. And I think the way I frame it is the overarching question I was trying to answer is, can you feed 8, 9, 10 billion people a nutritious diet without completely wrecking the planet at the same time? So that was the kind of big question I was trying to tackle there. So that was my kind of academic background. And the work I do now, I work for organization and a website called Our World in Data. And what we try to do there is be this kind of bridge between academic research, large databases and data providers, and the public, policymakers, journalists, basically anyone that's out there that can make some impact on the world or wants to understand the world better. And we basically present data and insights from the data globally on what we frame as the world's largest problems. And that ranges from environmental problems to hunger and nutrition, to poverty, health, inequality, war, what we frame as this really broad bucket of big problems that the world's facing. And we basically try to be these translators where we're trying to help people understand what's going on, how have things changed over time. We try to provide some insight on what we should maybe do next if we want to tackle these problems. So that's my kind of work that I do now, is this focus of really using data to understand what's going on in the world and these issues that we cover, and then communicating that through mostly writing, but I also come on podcasts and stuff and communicate that as well.
And would you say, I mean, given your background as a geoscientist, your primary interest is on the environment and climate change, and that begun looking sort of more closely at food and its impact on the environment and climate, but has broadened into looking at how other aspects of our life affect the environment?
Yeah, I think my initial route into this wasn't necessarily food. My initial way into this was I was concerned about climate change and other environmental problems. And I think then by studying them in more detail and looking at the data, what emerged is that food is a huge part of this. So that kind of emerged later as like, oh, this is a big driver of many of the environmental problems that we face. And then since then, a lot of my work still focuses on environmental problems, but most importantly, the intersection with human development, human needs, global progress in other ways, such that basically I'm trying to understand, can these two things be compatible, right? How do we improve human well-being across the world and over time, while also having a more positive impact on the environment? And is that even possible?
Which brings us to something that we may speak about later, which is the compatibility of climate solutions with economic prosperity and growth that I know about you wrote about in your new book. At the top here, as a scientist and as someone who's communicating information about these problems in the world from a kind of data-driven point of view, how do you go about your research and form your views? What does that process look like for kind of weighing up evidence, looking at data, and then analyzing data and arriving at a position that you then communicate in your books and through Our World in Data online?
So I think where I am now, it's slightly mixed from questions that people have in the kind of more general population, important questions that people have for which the kind of scientific consensus is pretty much formed. Like we have like pretty good evidence, we have pretty good understanding of many of these questions. And I know the relevant literature, I've looked at the relevant literature for a long time, and the general principles around that haven't changed much over time. And that stuff's relatively easy to communicate. And yes, you keep up to date with what's going on in the literature, but it doesn't change massively, or the underpinnings of that don't change massively. So that's one aspect, is of having done this for many years, a lot of the questions people have, I immediately know the answer. What's slightly different is there are some questions that emerge, in particular, less on the food stuff, but in particular on the more climate, energy type side, especially on solutions, where this stuff is actually moving very quickly and solutions are emerging pretty quickly, which is positive. But it means you need to constantly keep on top of the data and what's happening. And often I come to these questions not knowing what the answer is, but then being curious about wanting to find out. And there you have to, is this like quite difficult thing to do, but trying to remain relatively impartial and non-biased to whatever the data presents you as the answer to that particular question. So I think that's the balance. Some stuff is constantly changing and quickly over time, which means you have to keep on top of stuff. There are other questions that are pretty solid, and I kind of know the answer off my top of my head without digging into even more research.
Just to help us ground this kind of idea here, what would an example be of a question that there is a pretty solid consensus position on versus a question that maybe is a little newer because things are evolving and changing quite quickly and there's a lot more emerging data?
So like a good example here on food systems is we pretty much know what percentage of the world's greenhouse gas emissions come from food systems, right? And the estimates there range from around a quarter to a third based on methodology and particular inclusions and assumptions that you make, but it's in that general range of around a quarter to a third. That's not going to change rapidly over time, right? The emissions that we have this year are not going to be dramatically different from next year or the previous year. A question that emerges quite rapidly is stuff like when we're thinking about the energy transition, which is now moving quickly, do we have the minerals that we will need in order for the world to move to solar and wind and batteries and electric vehicles? That's a relatively new question and actually shifts quite a lot based on the technologies you're using, what assumptions are you making about how much battery storage you might need, etc. So these are the types of different questions that emerge quite rapidly, and you really need to keep on top of what the latest data is saying.
And you use the word whiplash in the introduction of your new book, and this idea of climate whiplash where people are kind of being exposed to all sorts of different views, and it can get quite confusing and I think paralyzing, where you hear so many different ideas that you just throw your hands up in the air and think, I'm just going to keep doing what I'm doing and not really commit to any change because I'm not sure what to do. Is it these questions where we have solid consensus where you think there is the greatest kind of whiplash, or is the whiplash coming more from these emerging questions where the data is like a little less clear?
I think it's both. And I think the issue is that like sometimes I get the whiplash or the reporting on these questions that are still emerging and are not clear. But the whiplash on the stuff that's very, very well established and we have a very, very clear idea on still gets out there and is still in the media quite prominently. Like the one clear example was, we know that if you were to switch if the average driver switches from a petrol car to an electric car, their carbon footprint will go down, right? And their range of other things will generally get better in terms of environmental metrics as a result. But you still see lots of headlines saying, I think the part of the issue there with the whiplash is it's not necessarily framed as electric car is generally better for your carbon footprint than a petrol car, but here are a couple of like caveats you should know, or like here are some challenges that we still need to fix to like improve this in some way. Instead, the headline is like often it's framed as like clean energy is like dirty secret, and then it becomes this kind of conspiratorial thing when if you ask anyone that researches in that area, like it's not a secret that the carbon emissions on an electric car are not zero. And I think where that's some of the issue comes in.
Yeah, like it's almost being framed in that sense that if the solution is not perfect, then it's some sort of like scam or there's information being hidden from you, right? But it doesn't necessarily have to be perfect for it to be better than what we're currently doing.
Yeah, and I think this is some of the issue with the way we discuss solutions, especially in the climate change space, where we're often looking for this absolute perfect solution that has first zero emissions today, not even just zero emissions in a couple of decades, zero emissions today, generates zero pollution, there's no waste, there's no issue with any issues in supply chains. It uses no land, and these solutions just don't exist, right? And that's the reality. But the issue is that if that's the bar we're going to set ourselves for finding solutions, then we're just going to stick with the status quo. And the status quo is that we have extremely high carbon emissions, we continue using fossil fuels, we continue producing air pollution from fossil fuels. So that's the issue, is we're searching for these perfect solutions, and the end result is that we just stick with the current system that we have, and the current system we have is not good.
What would you say are the biggest barriers at an individual level or a society level or a government level that stand in the way of us thinking more like you and using the data more like you? What is required from our governments and from us as an individuals, just in terms of how we're thinking about this topic?
I think what's really crucial is that data is nearly only useful in context. I think that's the crucial thing. Like, we're now awash in data. All of these kind of news reports and headlines and stuff I'm talking about, they usually contain some data or some numbers. But I think what is often the issue is it's very hard for us to put those numbers into context, to understand, is this a big problem? Is this a small problem? Is this an effective solution? Is it not? What are the costs? And in order to do that in a effective way, you need to have some context of what the alternative is, right? So, for example, if we're talking about the amount of waste that we would generate from solar panels or wind turbines, again, they do not produce zero waste, right? But if you just give a total number to someone that's in thousands or millions of tons, they just think, oh, that's just huge amounts. Like, look at the amount of waste that's generated from solar power or wind power. But that's not the right baseline and context to compare that to, right? What we should be comparing it to is the amount of waste we currently generate with the current system. And if you look at coal power, it generates vastly more waste than solar power or wind power. So I think what's really crucial is trying to provide context and being able to see what the right baseline or comparison is to compare to.
And how much of this, and this may be more of a question for a psychologist, but I'm just thinking about human nature, just fear in general about change. How much do you think fear plays into a kind of impulse or almost a kind of reactivity to some of these ideas just because they are new, and a fear that we may be being misled, and potentially trust issues with government and people putting these ideas forward?
So I think, I'm not sure if fear is the right term, but there's definitely, and this is true throughout history, there's always just a discomfort with new technologies, right? And you see that if you look in history with any new technology, there's initial resistance because it's different from what the current system is. And gradually that wanes over time. And that wanes over time because people see other people using that and they report good results, or they report how good it is, and generally you see this gradual effect where it diffuses throughout the population, and then people think it was crazy that they were ever resistant to it in the first place. But that process takes time. And I think for many people with the kind of technologies we're talking about, I think it's pretty reasonable to be slightly skeptical or a bit concerned, right? For someone that drives a petrol car, I can totally understand if they don't know anyone with an electric car, they've never been in an electric car or driven one, there will be just some resistance to, will it just break down on the motorway? Like, can I get a charging station? How does that process work? And I think that kind of discomfort in hurdle is very understandable, but starts to diffuse the more that people see the system building up around them, become familiar with other people that use that technology. And I think that gradually wanes over time. But I think initially there just always is resistance to new technology.
Are we observing that? Is there kind of survey data that suggests how people are thinking to thinking about some of these solutions, how receptive they are to them, has changed over the past 5 or 10 years?
So you see it very clearly in data, for survey data or satisfaction data for people that have adopted that technology, right? So there's lots of skepticism among the public about the process of switching to an electric car, for example, or an electric heat pump is another example. And skepticism is generally high, but then if you survey people that have one, the reports are extremely, extremely good. And 80 or 90+% say they would never go back to a petrol car, right? Or a gas boiler. And you can say there's maybe some selection bias in that, right? The people that move early are probably more likely to be positive about that. But you do see that generally in the data that once people have adopted that technology and got used to it, generally the results are fairly positive. I think the other really key barrier, and you see it in the survey data of reasons why someone won't switch to a given thing, the number one reason is nearly always cost. So what's really key is that these technologies need to be, or the alternatives need to be comparable or cheaper than the current technologies that we have. And then other barriers like resistance to change and worries about charging stations and stuff come in.
Yeah, I'd be interested, and I'm sure companies like Tesla and Rivian are looking at this, but the person who was very skeptical that then becomes an advocate, I wonder what it was that kind of got them over the line. I'm not sure if you have any ideas on that, what the main things are that would lead to someone going from that position of extreme skepticism to not only someone who is then utilizing that technology in their life, but is an advocate for it.
I honestly think the number one reason would be cost. I think for many of these technologies, and what's really key with the kind of energy transition that we're trying to do, like a really key part of how we tackle climate change is what we call electrification. And that's why I keep talking about electric vehicles and electric heat pumps and stuff. And the reason these are so important is, one, we know how to produce low carbon electricity, right? So we know then if you switch a device to electricity, we then can produce low carbon electricity to make it low carbon, that technology. But the other reason is that with these electrification, you get these huge efficiency gains, right? So to give the example of the switching from the petrol car to the electric car, to drive a given mile in an electric car, you use around a third to a quarter of the energy, right? So you have these huge efficiency gains and drops in the amount of energy you use. And that usually translates into savings in terms of cost. So I would suggest that the key metric that usually gets some skeptical people over the line is the substantial reductions in costs that come with running these technologies. We have sectors like road transport, like cars, trucks, etc., and heating, which are big emitters. And the main way we tackle that is to shift those to electricity. So you shift those to electricity, you get these good efficiency gains, and then you can deploy the solar and the wind and batteries in order to decarbonize that. That's the key transition we need to make there.
Howdy, friends. I would love your help. You know this, we know this. There are ads on our podcast here at The Proof. That is what allows us to bring all of these episodes to you at zero cost. We're always looking for new ways to make this experience better for you. But to do that, we need to know a little bit more information about you and the things that you like and perhaps don't like. To help with that, we've created a survey. This survey will help us understand the type of guests and topics that you enjoy most. It's quick, easy, and a really meaningful way to support the show. So if you would like to help shape the show and the brands that we partner with, please head to voicingchange.media/the proof to fill out our audience survey. That's voicingchange.media/the proof. What was the primary motivation behind the topic and the format of your new book, Clearing the Air?
I released a book last year called Not the End of the World. And in that book, I looked at 7 of our big environmental problems, and they each had one chapter. And it was really hard to distill an entire problem like air pollution or biodiversity or food or climate change into one chapter. But I did distill climate change into one chapter. But what I found is that when going and doing interviews like this, or book talks, or engagements on email and social media, is that people had a lot more in-depth questions about solutions and reservations about how we would be able to fix climate change. So this is partly how this book emerged, was like I've taken 50 of the most common questions I get asked at events and interviews and stuff, and wanted to distill them into like really quite short and snappy answers, but data-driven answers, right? So each question is kind of only a few pages long, with the idea that if someone comes across a headline on a particular topic or information on that specific topic in the media or in a discussion, they can quickly pick up the book and like get some idea of like, is this correct? Is this really off base? So I tried to like, you can read it from front to back, but the 50 questions mean you can also read it in a very modular way. You can just pick it up as a reference and find a couple of pages on that one question that someone has.
Right. So there's like questions on electric vehicles and batteries and plant-based meat alternatives and solar, all the things. You mentioned climate change a few times there. Before we go any deeper here, can we define that? When you say climate change, what do we specifically mean?
So by climate change, I mean, as humans, we are adding greenhouse gases to the atmosphere. Greenhouse gases have this warming effect on the planet, and currently we're on this trajectory where the world is warming. And the direct impacts of increased temperatures can have adverse impacts on stuff like crop yields, direct impacts on human health, especially for people already in warmer parts of the planet, but also has impacts on other kind of climatic phenomena like ice sheets and sea level and rainfall patterns. So there's, yes, the direct impacts of temperature, but also these other impacts that we're doing by changing the level of greenhouse gas emissions or concentrations in the atmosphere, and that impact on climate.
And if we kind of fast forward based on current projections, what does a warmer world, a warmer Earth actually look like? Like, what would that feel like as a human? What's that human experience like? And who is likely to be most impacted by that in terms of geographical location and also the time? Like, are we talking about us? Are we talking about our kids, our grandkids?
If we measure temperature change since what we define as pre-industrial, so from around 1850, which is when we really started pumping greenhouse gases into the atmosphere because we started burning coal and other fossil fuels, the planet has warmed on average by around just under 1.5 degrees at this point. Now, to many people, 1.5 degrees doesn't sound like very much. Like I live in Scotland, from summer to winter, we have swings of like 15 or 20 degrees, right? So it doesn't seem that huge. One thing to bear in mind there is that that's the global average for many countries on land, right? So you tend to get less rapid warming over water bodies, which is most of the planet, and more warming over land, right? Which means that where most of us live on land, obviously, we've actually seen a higher temperature rise than just 1.5. So some countries have seen 3 or 4 degrees of warming on average at this point. So that's one caveat. But as we project into the future, we can say so what we can do is we can model where we think our trajectory of carbon emissions are going based on the policies we have in place, etc. at the moment. And if you project that out, what we think is that by 2100, so by the end of the century, the path we're currently on will be at around 2.5 to 3 degrees of warming. So from where we are now, we'll add another 1 degree or 1.5 degrees from where we are. To be very clear, we can change that and we can reduce that by taking action, right? So if we reduce our greenhouse gas emissions relatively quickly, we can bring that down from 2.5 degrees to 2 degrees. So that pathway is dependent on what we do. But to give some context on what some of these impacts might look like, I think for me that there are a couple of physical changes on the planet, and then I guess impacts, more direct impacts on humans and human systems. I think for me, the two biggest concerns are, one, the direct impact of extreme heat. So as the world warms, heat waves will become more intense. And for people that are already living in really pretty warm parts of the world, particularly around the tropics and the subtropics, you could see pretty extreme temperatures, especially during these heatwave events. And we know that these can have pretty adverse impacts on human health. So I think when people are thinking about, for example, someone dying from heat, what they imagine is someone has heat stroke and dies very immediately. But what heat also does, and most deaths that result from extreme temperatures, is actually it increases your risk of stuff like stroke or cardiovascular disease. So often, especially for older, more vulnerable populations, you can often reduce life expectancy by a year or at least a couple of years in these extreme temperatures. And part of who's vulnerable there is, one, dependent on where you live in the world. So warmer regions, because higher temperatures might push kind of towards that envelope of where humans can comfortably live, but also basically the capacity you have to adapt. And a large part of the capacity you have to adapt is based on how rich you are, right? So if you live in a particularly warm place, but you can have air conditioning in your home, you have really resilient health systems, you're not forced to be outside working in extreme heat during the day, you have much lower impact and are much less exposed than someone that doesn't have aircon, is out working in agriculture or construction all day. So part of this is about human vulnerability to this as well. And then the other really key impact that I think we need to address and think about is the impact on crop yield and food production. So increased temperatures can, especially for some crops, reduce yields. And there is the added impact of changes in water availability, either flooding or droughts. And they are the crops that are most vulnerable are generally maize is particularly vulnerable, and sorghum and millet. And these tend to be grown, again, around the kind of tropics and the subtropics. So these are the crops that are most vulnerable, and obviously adverse impacts there would have impacts on nutrition and hunger and food production.
And just to be clear, so you're saying that use the year 2100, and I think you said that if we kind of just kept going along the current path we're on, with the current trajectory of warming, we'd be at 2.5 to 3 degrees warmer than pre-industrial temperatures. But you think that we could get that to around 2 degrees if we make some changes. But this isn't like a switch. These effects that you're talking about are not just going to be seen at the year 2100 if we don't act. But I'm assuming, some of these changes we're already seeing around the world to some extent in certain parts of the world. And if we weren't to make changes, we would gradually see more and more effect leading up to 2100.
Yeah, so I think maybe some misconception some people have is that these are like very clearly defined like thresholds in the system where just suddenly all of the impacts come, or like the big impacts come. And that's generally not. There are some parts of the climate system where we think there are particular points where you could see quite abrupt change. But for most of these impacts, it is this kind of gradual but increasing intensity, gradual change over time, such that, we're not just going to be fine until 2100 and then suddenly all of the impacts come. We will see increased impacts until that point. The good news there, I guess, if you want to call it the good news, is that does also just give us time to adapt. As I said earlier, part of this is about our vulnerability to these impacts. So over the next 75 years, we have time to develop crops that are more resilient to drought or higher temperatures. We have time for people, especially in lower income countries that are more vulnerable, to maybe move out of agriculture into other sectors where they're less vulnerable, or increase income such that they can get access to air conditioning and become more resilient in that way. So yes, there's no kind of switch where suddenly all of the impacts come. It is this gradual effect over time.
And you said in your book that this is a problem we can solve, and there's still plenty of time. And I see you in this space as certainly as an optimist. Is that optimism just you by nature, Dr. Hannah Ritchie, as a person, or is the data leading you to be optimistic about this?
I definitely wouldn't say it's my natural state or kind of personality trait in any way. Like, I didn't used to be very optimistic. I used to be pretty pessimistic, actually. And I kind of did have this mentality that kind of it was too late to do anything, or there was no point in doing anything because this things were just never going to change. And I think that's changed largely because of the data. Well, one aspect is it's changed because of the data, and I think another aspect is I've just grown to find that, at least for me, and I think for some other people, is actually just a more effective mindset to have if we want to make progress. I think my previous mindset that it was too late and there's no point in us doing anything is just clearly not effective in getting us anywhere. So yes, a lot of this optimism has emerged from the data, where even over the past decade, I think the trajectory that we are on has changed and our expectations have changed. So as I was saying, by 2100 on our current trajectory, we're looking at between 2.5 to 3 degrees. But go back a decade and what we were talking about was 3.5 to 4 degrees by the end of the century, right? So that is bending. And there is very clear signs in the data that the solutions we need to this are, one, getting increasingly good, two, getting increasingly cheap, and 3 are starting to be now rolled out at a reasonable pace. And it needs to accelerate and we need to make improvements, but those changes are now starting to happen.
And if you were to simplify that for people that are perhaps new to this topic, and we were to think about, just broadly speaking, we can double click on some of these things, the top few or handful of main drivers of that increase in temperature that we have some control over, and what the top high level solutions would be that are proven to be both effective and financially viable, feasible, things that we can roll out without having any kind of net negative effect on humanity or the environment.
So I think I like to break it into a kind of pie or kind of box of solutions. The very clear, so I like to split it into like the impact of the drivers of warming have been releases of greenhouse gases, and I like to split that into energy and industry on one hand, and then food and agriculture on the other. And the kind of general mix there is around 75% energy and industry and around 25% or a quarter coming from our food. And we need to tackle both, right? But on the energy and industry side, there are a couple of overarching things we need to do, and actually some really positive trends there that means that we can make progress now. So we need to decarbonize our electricity, right? So our electricity grid, we need to move away from coal and gas as the main fuel sources there. The problem we were in 10 or 15 years ago is that the alternatives to fossil fuels for electricity were way more expensive, right? So solar, wind, nuclear is still more expensive, but these technologies were more expensive than fossil fuels, right? So you were basically hinging or relying on some kind of altruistic notion that, one, rich countries would make that kind of economic sacrifice and pick the more expensive option. And two, that lower income countries where lots of people are in energy poverty would choose the more expensive option at the expense of pulling people out of energy poverty in order to tackle climate change. And to me, that just was never going to happen, which is why I was very pessimistic. What we've seen over the last 10 or 15 years is the cost of these technologies, in particular solar, wind, and batteries, like they've plummeted, right? So the cost of solar is down by around 90%, same for batteries. And what that means is that they're now comparable or undercutting the cost of fossil fuels. So that puts us in a really strong position. So one, the solution we need to tackle climate change and air pollution also just now makes sense economically and increasingly makes sense economically. So you have this matching up, which is really, really positive. So that's one thing. We need to decarbonize electricity. We have sectors like road transport, like cars, trucks, etc., and heating, which are big emitters. And the main way we tackle that is to shift those to electricity, right? So you shift those to electricity, you get these good efficiency gains, and then you can deploy the solar and the wind and batteries in order to decarbonize that. That's the key transition we need to make there. And then when it comes to industry, there are a couple of big emitters there that I think people underestimate. And these are quite tricky ones to tackle, but we are getting there in terms of being able to innovate and build solutions to these. So cement and steel production both emit around 7 to 8% of global emissions each, right? So cement alone is double to triple the amount that comes from aviation, right? So we all think about aviation and flying as this huge emitter, but we forget about stuff like cement and steel, and these are really, really big. And I can go into more detail on the particular techno solution, but basically the point there is that we're not quite there yet on finding a solution that can scale overnight or can scale very quickly, but we are finding solutions that means that within a few decades, we can decarbonize a lot of these sectors' emissions. And then the final aspect is food, right? And there are a couple of big emitters there, or contributors there. By far the biggest chunk is from our food systems is either emissions from land use change, right? So basically cutting down forests or transforming grasslands in order to make room for grazing lands or crop lands. And then direct emissions on the farm. And that's a combination of cows burping, so cows burp, and sheep burp methane, which is a really powerful greenhouse gas. So that's a big chunk of those emissions. Rice production also emits methane. That's one that I think a lot of people are not aware of.
So the methane from cows comes from burping, not from farting?
Yeah, I think a very small amount comes from farting, but I think people like to say it's the cow farts, but it's a much larger percentage is from the burping rather than the farting, yeah.
Yeah, not to digress too much here, but my mum's always called farts bottom burps.
I mean, that also works, but this is a front burp, I guess.
Yeah.
So that's where most of the methane from cows comes from. And then there are other emissions from farming and agriculture, which is the release of emissions mainly from either manure, so manure emits greenhouse gases, and then synthetic fertilizer. So we use synthetic fertilizer and we put that on lots of crops, and that also produces greenhouse gas emissions. So that's a very quick overview of the kind of pie that we're trying to tackle and what we need to do to address that. The way I generally frame this is that if you were to rank animals from kind of most environmentally impactful to least, it generally goes in size order. So at the top you have cows, so beef is generally the highest carbon footprint and land footprint, then lamb, then pork or pig meat, and then chicken and fish. So it goes from big animal to small animal. And even if you don't reduce meat consumption at all, switching from beef and lamb to fish and chicken would dramatically reduce the land footprint, but also the carbon footprint of your diet. So that's a key swap.
Most people still think of creatine as something only for athletes. But while creatine is certainly good for muscle health, that's only part of this mighty supplement's story. Researchers at the University of Kansas Medical Center are even studying creatine today for treating Alzheimer's, with preliminary data suggesting that high doses, around 20 grams per day, can increase brain creatine levels by about 11% in Alzheimer's patients, which may result in improved cognitive function. While the data here is certainly emerging, it's a very positive early signal in a field of science that has thus far largely failed to find helpful interventions. My personal dose of creatine is 10 grams of Momentus's creatine monohydrate per day, but I am open to increasing it to 20 grams per day as more evidence becomes available. When I'm consistent with this, I notice faster recovery, better focus, and more sustained energy. And with Momentus's new lemon creatine travel packs, it is easier than ever before to stay consistent. Naturally flavored, perfectly portioned, and simple to mix with water wherever you are. And every batch is NSF certified for sport, independently tested for purity, label accuracy, and banned substances. So if you want a creatine that's clean, third-party tested, convenient, and effective, look no further. Head to livemomentus.com and use the code LIVINGPROOF for up to 35% off your first order. That's livemomentus.com and use the code LIVINGPROOF at checkout for up to 35% off your first order. Let's double click a little bit on food, and then we can get to energy and industry. And we've dedicated an entire episode to food, so we won't go through all of it. But if we're thinking about food and agriculture's contributions to greenhouse gas emissions, which I think you've stated a couple of times, is about a quarter of the globe's greenhouse gas emissions come from agriculture. And you mentioned there that using less land is important. What does this look like in terms of changing the way that we're growing food, the type of food that we're growing, and the type of diet that individuals are eating?
So I think there are a couple of shifts that we need to make to one, solve the land problem, but also at the same time tackle the climate change and emissions problem. And the biggest shift we can make is towards more plant-based diets, right? So when you basically rank different foods based on either land use or greenhouse gas emissions, or actually water use, generally the results are the same, which is that animal-based products per unit of food or per gram of protein or per calorie tend to use much more land and emit much more greenhouse gases. So you tend to have animal-based foods at the top, and I can go through the ranking of those because there actually are quite large differences, and then plant-based foods generally at the bottom. So a switch to a more plant-based diet is probably the single biggest thing you can do for food in order to tackle land use, but also tackle climate change at the same time.
What would you say to kind of steelman this position? I've seen folks push back that are on the other side of this argument who would say here that lowers the nutrient density of the diet, and these analyses are based on calories, not necessarily the nutrient density of the diet. Have you looked at kind of nutrient density of individual foods or dietary patterns and their association with greenhouse gas emissions?
Yeah, so generally the metrics that we look at here are calories and protein. And for both of these nutritional aspects, the pattern I just described is true. I think it's correct that those rankings for individual foods might change if you were to pick a particular micronutrient, right? So if you were to pick iron or vitamin B12, like plant-based products just don't have vitamin B12, so you would actually just not get an answer there. So there are particular nutrients where the ranking would change. But when you start to break it down to the micronutrient level, I think it's then becomes more difficult to focus only on the comparison of one individual food, right? I think when we're talking about whole diets, it's about the combination of foods that you're eating in order to meet your nutrient requirements across the entire day or week or longer timescales. And then when you basically the point there is that even if particular plant-based foods are maybe deficient in one particular micronutrient or vitamin or mineral, you can build a plant-based diet that is sufficient in all of these aspects. And that diet on aggregate will still have lower land use and emissions, etc., than a more animal-based diet.
Yeah, it's a little bit like the kind of very reductionist view of comparing the amino acid or protein content of one food versus the other, when at least in Western countries, people eat with diversity and are getting amino acids and protein from a variety of foods that complement one another and kind of ensure that someone's getting enough total amino acids and protein across the day.
I think to steelman that position, I think there are like very valid concerns. I think that in particular contexts, that's an issue, right? So like in particular contexts, I'm thinking more in lower income countries where people maybe don't have access to a wide range of foods and be able to afford a wide range of foods. Sometimes the animal-based product is the only source of a given nutrient that they have. But I think that's very different from many of the listeners that I'm speaking to or I'm writing about, where usually the choice and affordability is there to have a very varied diet. I think then the additional missing element that is very addressable, but I think is important, is then education and people understanding what combination of foods and what a complete plant-based diet would look like in order to get those nutrients.
And that also brings us to the important point of there is the data that informs what a planetary kind of friendly, healthy diet looks like. And then there are separate question is who can access that, and therefore, in parts of the world where they cannot access that, it might be that there's a different dietary approach that is best, but also solutions that are needed in those parts of the world so that they can eventually access that type of diet in a way that's affordable.
And I think, not to loop it too much back into the energy space, but I think there also just needs to be some consideration for the fact that, especially for people in lower income countries or people generally on low incomes that maybe are also in energy poverty and are not using a ton of fossil fuels, etc., the overall environmental impact is low. And the overall meat or dairy consumption is also low. And at those very, very low levels, it isn't a huge environmental problem. So I think that's also just important to note, is that the marginal impact of someone that's not consuming very much meat or dairy and reducing that further is very, very low in comparison to people that eat quite a lot, reducing it by a smaller relative amount.
Yeah, it's a little bit rich for us to sit here in Western countries and tell them to eat less animal foods if it was to affect the nutrient status of their diet. Totally on board with that. For those of us that are in Western countries and have access to a wide variety of foods and have the means to change our diet, is the Eat Lancet Planetary Health diet still like the resource that you would recommend people look at, or is there a different kind of dietary pattern or set of guidelines that you would refer to?
I have mixed views on the Eat Lancet diet, largely because I'm not super convinced that being extremely prescriptive on you can have X number of grams of this or X number of grams of that is particularly useful to people, or they're particularly open to that. I think many people are quite opposed to being told you can have X number of grams of this and no more. So my general recommendation is, and this is partly also trying to meet people where they are, is giving people general principles for what's most effective. And the current situation we're in on food is that these changes in overall meat or dairy consumption, actually dairy's down quite a bit in some countries, but in general meat consumption is that the stuff is not moving very quickly. And therefore, any change in a positive direction that gets the ball rolling for me is a win, right? So even if someone's reduction of a given animal product was not to the level of the Eat Lancet diet, I would still see that as a positive if they are reducing their intake. So I try to be less prescriptive of you should eat X amount and give people general principles of making this change or making this change would have a quite a substantial impact on your overall impact.
Can we step through those? So what would those general principles be, or leading swaps that people could consider that you feel, based on the data, would lead to the greatest kind of lowering of the greenhouse gas footprint of their dietary pattern?
Yeah, so the biggest one by far is to move from a animal-based diet to a completely plant-based diet, right? That's where you get the maximum gains. And there, the biggest change you would have, if you wanted to reduce it to the maximum amount and still have a complete diet, is to switch to what I would call the very traditional plant-based products, like beans and lentils and those types of stuff, rather than the kind of meat substitute products. Generally, the meat substitute products have a slightly higher environmental impact than your kind of legumes, etc. But they have a much, much lower impact than animal products still, right? So meat substitute products are fantastic and I rely on them a lot, but kind of legumes and traditional, what I would frame as traditional plants still have a lower impact. So that complete switch is the maximum you can possibly get. But then I acknowledge that many people are not willing to do that or don't feel ready to do that now. So any general reduction in meat and dairy consumption, I would say, is generally positive for environmental impact. But the biggest, again, is bang for your buck, even if you don't want to reduce total amount, is swaps, right, within animal-based products. And the way I generally frame this is that if you were to rank animals from kind of most environmentally impactful to least, it generally goes in size order. So at the top you have cows, so beef is generally the highest carbon footprint and land footprint, then lamb, then pork or pig meat, and then chicken and fish. So it goes from big animal to small animal. And even if you don't reduce meat consumption at all, switching from beef and lamb to fish and chicken would dramatically reduce the land footprint, but also the carbon footprint of your diet. So that's a key swap. The one caveat I'd add there is that swap is very, very positive from an environmental point of view. That swap is very negative from an animal welfare point of view. So there's a very unfortunate trade-off there where switching from beef or lamb to chicken or fish is negative for animal welfare generally. One, because you have to kill more chickens and fish to get the same amount of meat, so the number of lives cost. And then generally welfare conditions of kind of chicken and fish, especially fish farming, tend to be poorer than you'd get for a cow or a sheep. So that's the unfortunate trade-off.
Are there any other kind of unintended consequences of making those swaps with regards to the environment? I'm thinking about the ocean, whether there would be any knock-on effect, outside of emissions like ocean acidification or other things that we think about when we think about the farming of fish.
Yeah, so the one, wild fish catch, but also fish farming does have other impacts. When it comes to wild fish catch, there are just fish populations that are overfished and local populations are strained. So that partly depends on the type of fish that you are switching to and also where that is produced. It's often very hard to give. I think when I discuss this, people want to know, like, okay, tell me the fish that I can eat then. But often it depends very much on these local impacts and these local populations. So often I'll refer people to, there's usually for a given country particular guidelines and recommendations on types of fish that are less overfished and have healthier populations. So there are these negative knock-on impacts. When it comes to fish farming, it's still the case that you need to grow feed in fish farming, and sometimes wild fish are then fed to fish farms, right? So there are these other impacts to consider as well.
I think the other thing that people think about here that comes to mind is exposure to heavy metals and microplastics. Certainly that's something I hear from people as soon as there's a recommendation to consume more seafood, given there's so much discussion around pollution in the ocean. Is that something that you've kind of come up against or seen as a counter argument here?
Not specifically in the marine context, but there's a lot of discussion more broadly just about the human health impacts of microplastics. And to be transparent, I've found the research on this very disappointing in terms of it's really just not clear what the impacts are. And there are some studies which I think have been relatively poorly done that suggest quite negative impacts, but it's really, really hard to say at this stage what the impacts of microplastics are on human health. But I'd say generally there are very clearly impacts of plastic accumulation in the ocean, but I think the reality is that we're all ingesting quite a lot of microplastics all the time. So I'm not that convinced that by eating a bit more fish, you're dramatically increasing the amount of microplastics you're consuming, because I generally think we're exposed to this stuff all the time.
Yeah, this is another example of a solution, a swap. It might not be perfect, but certainly, at least from a greenhouse gas emission point of view and tackling this problem of a warming climate, it seems to be beneficial and a step in the right direction. And look, when you step back and just look at the average diet in Western populations, most people aren't eating the recommended servings of fatty fish or fish a week anyway, which is like two or three servings. So in addition to those dietary swaps you mentioned, and you step through the animals by size and spoke about the trade-off with regards to ethics, where do animal foods like dairy and eggs sit within that conversation? So
eggs are pretty low, largely because chickens are relatively efficient and we've actually, and this again has a negative impact on animal welfare, but we've become very, very efficient at producing large chickens that we can get meat from, but also chickens that produce eggs at much higher frequency than they would in the wild. So generally the footprint of eggs is very, very low, probably lower than chicken and fish actually. Dairy is better than beef because you get a lot of milk from a single cow, but worse than chicken and fish. So it kind of sits somewhere in the middle, maybe alongside pork, where it kind of has this mid position of being better than beef and lamb from a carbon perspective, but generally worse than chicken or fish or egg.
And when it comes to beef, I know you and I have spoken previously about this kind of marketing campaign. I think it was a little hotter 2 or 3 years ago, that it's not the cow, it's the how. And regenerative beef, it seemed to really have its moment. And at least from my kind of vantage point, it seems that societal attention around this has kind of dissipated a little bit. It's faded away. I'm not sure if that's just a fatigue. People are tired of hearing the same thing. What are your views on regenerative agriculture today and the science and data that exists surrounding it as a solution here? So rather than people needing to eat less beef, this idea that they can or should just eat better beef.
So I think the discussion on regenerative agriculture, I think, for me at least, was most vocal and kind of started in the regenerative grazing beef production part of the discussion. And I actually think in the last few years it's expanded quite a lot. Now we're talking more generally about regenerative agriculture, also in cropland systems and other farming systems. And I think part of the challenge I have is that when you get into these discussions, there are very loose or sometimes no actual guidelines or definitions for what regenerative farming means. I think for many people it's a nice word and it sounds nice and it sounds environmentally friendly, but when you actually try to drill down to like, what does that actually mean? Or what are the inputs or outputs that you're actually measuring that would make this thing regenerative? It becomes very, very fuzzy and actually very different. If you ask different people what it means, they give you very, very different answers, which is very, very hard to then consolidate and move forward with, especially in a policy environment. And I think, one, that's true among practitioners or advocates, but also true if you look in the academic literature, there's actually even poorer agreement on what regenerative agriculture means or what it should, the outcomes it should be generally producing. So I think that's one issue, is that it's very, very loose with definitions and metrics, which is a challenge. But then to come specifically to regenerative grazing, I would generally say it's a very hyped solution to this problem. To be clear, I think there is still a huge amount of scope on the production side to reduce impacts, right? So this is not all just about if everyone just makes the switch, it'll be fine. I think there's still a huge amount for us to reduce emissions on the producer side by optimizing for producers that have the lowest land use, that have the lowest emissions. And the kind of biggest study that I often cite on this, the discussion we've been having, is around these average figures of these rankings. But especially for animal products, and especially beef and lamb, if you look at the full distribution, it's massive, right? You can have one beef or lamb producer that has land use or carbon emissions that are at least 10 times, if not 50 times higher than the best producer. So there are still huge differences among these products. What's really, really important is that even the best beef producers still have a higher impact than the worst plant-based products, right? So this is the argument that the global average carbon emissions for beef production is high, but the beef I'm getting is clearly better than plant-based products. Also just doesn't stack up with the data. But there are these huge differences between animal product producers, and there's lots of scope for us to optimize towards the lower impact producers, and that does have an impact. But a lot of this argument for regenerative grazing, I think, breaks down when you generally look at studies comparing grain-fed beef and grass-fed beef. Often you find that the grain-fed beef actually has lower carbon emissions than the grass-fed one. One, because the feed and the diet is very optimized to maximize growth. So they're very, very efficient systems. And that's generally pretty good for carbon emissions. But also the amount of land that's needed is much, much lower. And I think we often underestimate what we frame as the opportunity costs of land use. So we think about the carbon emissions, but what we often don't take account of is how much carbon could that land be sequestering or sucking up if you were to remove kind of human impact in agricultural systems and just let it regenerate. And generally, those emissions can be pretty substantial and would generally trump any of the quoted emissions captured that you get from regenerative agriculture or grazing.
Yeah, that comes back to context and looking at the comparison. Because I can see at face value, if you just have the picture of the CAFO, this intense farming system in your mind, and then you have the picture of the cow out on pasture, just at face value without thinking about any deeper context, it would seem that cow out on land is going to be better for the environment. But what you just mentioned there is, well, actually, because it uses more land, it may not be better than the more intensive factory farming that's growing cows really quickly. But also we have to introduce this other comparison of how that land could be used without sort of using that using that land to grow food at all as a wild ecosystem.
I think the one point, like there is relatively convincing data that in some contexts, having very low density animals grazing, as in like there's not that many on a pretty large area, can have some positive impacts for carbon uptake in the soil. But again, the context there is crucial as we're talking about very, very low density. So the output of those systems in terms of meat production is extremely low. And if you take that and you extrapolate that to the fact that we need to feed 8, 9 or 10 billion people in the coming decades, the amount of meat we could each get with the land that we have, and we'd still be using huge amounts of land for agriculture with some opportunity cost, we would be talking about tiny, tiny amounts of meat consumption that we could all get. So I think some of the challenge with the solutions that are proposed is that, yes, they work for maybe very small populations, and they maybe worked for populations in the past where the global population was 5 million, but they just don't scale to a population of 8 or 9 or 10 billion people.
Yeah, and I think that message is certainly a little bit lost from some of the proponents of regenerative grazing, but they also may be just thinking more about their kind of local farm and not the big picture. Coming back to the plant-based foods, you mentioned that the kind of best regenerative solution production of beef would still have a greater impact than the kind of worst plant-based food production. And this gets me thinking about plant-based meat alternatives. And you mentioned that you consume these. Over the last, I think, 2 or 3 years, it feels like there has been a bit of a smear campaign against plant-based meat alternatives. There's certainly been a lot of headlines about these foods, labeling them as ultra-processed and therefore inherently unhealthy. I've certainly seen people make claims that they're no better for the environment, and they may actually be worse for the environment than consuming beef. Certainly people that are promoting regenerative beef are often pointing out that monocrops are used to produce the plants that go into these plant-based meat alternatives. First question here is, do you think there has been a coordinated effort from the meat industry to label these foods as sort of junk food?
I don't think I have a take on how coordinated the effort has been, but I've definitely also noticed a significant increase in, I think, the pushback and some of the narratives around them. I think rather than it being a concerted pushback from the meat industry, I think actually probably the growing narrative that I'm most concerned about is I think more broadly beyond just meat and meat substitutes, there is growing discussion around ultra-processed foods and negative impacts of ultra-processed foods. And I think then you have plant-based meat substitute products kind of being forced right into the middle of that. So I think in some sense it's been kind of kicked up among this broader rising concern and debate and discussion around ultra processed food. I'm sure there's some pushback from the meat industry from the perspective that these products offer some competition. I don't know the scale or size of it, but I think the narrative on this has changed, largely based on, I think, health concerns around ultra processed foods.
And then again, it brings us back to, what are we comparing to? If we go back to the origins of these products, at least largely, I think if you were to look at big companies like Impossible or Beyond, they were really catering for people that were eating beef, or are catering for people that enjoy beef, but back to your point you made earlier, are not on board this idea of just shifting to kidney beans and black beans and tofu. And so the idea was that swapping beef for the plant-based meat alternative would be a healthier step, probably, and beneficial for the environment. It wasn't that these foods were produced necessarily for people that were already eating a completely plant-based diet as an alternative to eating beans.
Yeah, and I think there's definitely pushback from meat lovers or heavy meat eaters that really dislike these products. But as a vegan myself, I also see this pushback from people that are already vegans, but are more, I don't know if you frame it as the more traditional type that do rely on beans and legumes, and that's the part of their diet, where the kind of narrative from them is like, why would you ever need these highly processed foods? Like, beans and lentils and legumes are fine. and again, I think that's just a misunderstanding of who the target audience of these products are. They're for people who would not make that switch and would never make that switch to the traditional plant-based products. But by adopting the plant-based meat substitute products, one, they're much more likely to switch. They will have a positive impact on the environment and animal welfare, and will generally probably improve some of their health markers at the same time. Maybe not as much as doing the full switch to the beans and legumes.
And for folks that want to kind of double click on that, go back and listen to my episode with Dr. Christopher Gardner. He ran a randomized controlled trial looking at the Beyond meat products and actually compared them to organic beef and sausages and like high quality, what you would deem as high quality meat, and did find some improvements in certain biomarkers that we would say are important, like LDL cholesterol, without seeing an increase in things like blood pressure, which we may hypothesize could be associated with higher sodium content, which interestingly in his study, he found that people were adding salt to the organic beef products anyway. So the actual total salt intake, despite the plant-based alternatives having a little more salt in them, ended up being pretty similar across the dietary patterns. So people can go back and check that out. But just on the environment here, to kind of double click on that, what is the environmental impact of producing plant-based meat alternatives?
So it's generally lower than animal products, much lower than beef, much lower than lamb, much lower than dairy. Some of the products are better than chicken, some are just comparable to chicken in terms of carbon footprint. So there are some products where if you were to switch from chicken to the plant-based alternative, you wouldn't make a huge impact on your carbon footprint, but it would still be relatively low. Like some of the products here that I'm thinking of, so corn, they produce mycoprotein. Mycoprotein is very, very low carbon, but often the carbon footprint of the final product is increased because they will often use egg as the binding agent. So that additional egg tends to bring up the carbon footprint to make it more comparable with chicken. But the data is pretty clear that if you are switching generally from animal products to these plant-based meat substitutes, that your carbon footprint would go down.
Before wellness was a trend, Bragg was already setting the standard. More than 100 years ago, Paul and Patricia Bragg believed that health wasn't about chasing quick fixes. It was about finding balance and choosing what works. That's how Bragg Live Foods was born, America's original health food company. Today, Bragg continues to deliver on that mission with their time-tested, apple cider vinegar. Unlike passing wellness trends, their recipe has been trusted for generations thanks to gut-loving ingredients like acetic acid. It's raw, USDA organic, naturally fermented, unfiltered, and most importantly, unpasteurized. In every format, from the original liquid apple cider vinegar to flavorful apple cider vinegar blends to their convenient sugar-free apple cider vinegar supplements, Bragg is still offering a dose of what works. Visit bragg.com and use the promo code SIMON to get 20% off your first order. That's promo code SIMON at bragg.com. Moving along to energy. Can you walk us through what fossil fuels actually are? Where does this energy come from? And why are fossil fuels, I guess, considered natural but not renewable?
So fossil fuels have basically been forming over the course of millions of years. So these are products that have taken millions of years to form. They're generally basically old, you could almost see them as old fossils that under very high temperatures and very high pressures over a long period of time have formed these relatively energy dense forms of fuel. Underground, we dig them up, and then when we burn them, that energy is released and we can use some of that energy. A lot of that energy is also wasted, which I think people don't realize, but we can use that energy. The issue is that as a byproduct of that burning, you get carbon dioxide, which is a greenhouse gas and is driving climate change. And you also get, and this is true generally when you burn anything, you get these local air pollutants, these particulates that are also really bad for human health. So that's another negative byproduct of fossil fuel burning, which actually, from a human health perspective and human impact perspective, at the moment is actually much larger than the climate change problem, right? So roughly around 7 million people globally die prematurely every year from air pollution. And that's not anywhere near the numbers that are currently dying from climate change. So air pollution is also a huge problem. But the reason the fossil fuels are not renewable is because once we've dug them up, and again, this has been forming over millions of years, once we dig them up and burn them, that's gone, right? You can't get that energy back. That fuel is completely consumed. And the reality is that we are taking these energy sources that have taken these really long periods of time to form, and we're now releasing all that energy and burning all of that in the space of decades or centuries. So we're then consuming that energy extremely, extremely quickly.
This might be a silly question, but where does that energy go that we lose?
So it's released as heat, like directly as heat. So there's like an interesting question of like how much of the climate change problem is driven by the greenhouse gases and the kind of warming impact they have in trapping heat, and how much comes from the actual physical heat that's generated as you burn that stuff. And the amount that's physically released from burning the stuff is much, much less than the greenhouse gas effect, but it's still relatively substantial. I mean, you get you can understand this if you have a petrol car and you put your hand kind of over the bonnet or the engine, it gets hot, right? And that's wasted heat. That's the heat that's generated as waste from the basically the burning of the fuel in the engine.
And by contrast, what is a renewable energy source by definition? Is it just that what we're using to produce energy is infinite? Not
infinite. Like we don't have infinite amounts of solar power that reaches the earth and we can harvest. We have huge amounts, and actually way, way more than we would ever need. So like we're not at risk of running out in some way. But by renewable, basically that process of use can continue basically indefinitely, right? So the fact that we've used solar power today does not mean that we have less solar power to use tomorrow. Whereas if I'd have this lump of coal, if I burn that today, there's no coal tomorrow to burn.
Right. So the coal is like having a savings account that we have a certain amount of money in, but we're drawing down on it and when we're not topping it up.
Yeah, exactly. Like we need to stop using fossil fuels before this would happen from a climate change perspective, because the amount of warming we would get would be so substantial. But if we just kept burning fossil fuels, we would eventually run out and we would have no energy source. Whereas that's not the case for solar or wind.
Has anyone run that calculation? When would we run out of fossil fuels?
So it's sometimes quite hard to estimate, or the estimates change. And the reason the estimates change is because we're very, very good at finding new resources of coal, oil, and gas. So the way you'd run that calculation is you would say how much coal or oil or gas does the world have, and how much are we consuming every year. And then you can divide one by the other and work out, okay, if we keep using fossil fuels at this rate, we would have 100 years. But the challenge there is that we often will find new resources, so the amount of reserves that we know we have goes up a bit. But usually you're talking about, I don't know, a century or so of burning at current levels. But again, that changes.
Right, but in that time, the bigger problem that we will run into is the heating of the planet.
Yeah, if we keep burning fossil fuels at our current rate for another 100 years, the temperature rise would be extreme. Yeah.
Some people argue that we can just capture the carbon from burning fossil fuels. How realistic is that kind of proposed solution of carbon capture at a large scale compared to replacing fossil fuels with renewables?
So from a purely physical perspective, you can do it, or you can at least capture from some sources most of it. Often you'll get some leakage, but you can get relatively what we call high capture rates. But you can only really do that effectively where you have a single point source, right? So a power plant. So if you take a coal power plant, you could feasibly stick something on the end that captures the carbon before it comes out into the atmosphere, and then basically shove it underground and it will stay there, right? So from a physical perspective, we can do that, and you could do that with a range of our sources, but what's really key is that they need to be kind of centralized in order to do that. The challenge, well, there are many challenges with that, or kind of negatives, I think, for that solution relative to moving to low carbon energy. But the really key one is that carbon capture and storage just adds cost to our current energy, right? So your energy costs would necessarily have to get more expensive than what just burning coal and releasing that into the atmosphere would be. So your energy would just get more expensive. And I don't want to live in a world where energy is more expensive. I want cheaper energy. And the alternatives that we've now developed are now much cheaper than generally burning stuff like coal or gas and then adding carbon capture and storage on the end. The other issue there is that many of our emissions come from places that are not a single point source that you could just put like a thing on the end of a power plant, right? Your car, we can't all have carbon capture and storage things on the exhaust pipe of our cars, right? So you have these really diffuse sources of emissions too, which you wouldn't be able to do with carbon capture and storage.
So it's price, like we were discussing earlier with the electric vehicles, that really stands in the way of wider adoption of renewables today?
For the deployment of renewables or carbon capture and storage?
For the deployment of renewables, like there seems like there's so many arguments for broad adoption of solar, of wind. What is it that's standing in the way of faster adoption of this? Is it that these technologies are still expensive, or at least upfront they are expensive to transition? Is it lobbying to protect the profits and interests of fossil fuel companies? What's standing in the way of faster adoption, or are we adopting this really quickly?
So the adoption rates and deployment rates have been going up pretty quickly. They will go higher, and we want to accelerate that even further, but they are going up pretty rapidly. And I think the core reason they're going up rapidly is cost. So they are just becoming increasingly cheap. And if you have cheap energy source available, surprise, people will deploy it and build it. So this is already happening. In terms of current barriers, in some contexts, yes, the upfront costs are the issue. So the cost structure of fossil fuels compared to renewables is quite different. If you were to build a fossil fuel plant, the upfront or the capital cost would be kind of moderate, but actually most of the cost then comes from buying the fuel, right? So the cost of buying the coal or then buying the gas, and that's obviously extended over many, many decades, like the decades for which the plant is running. So you have this kind of protracted timeline for which you can basically spread the whole costs over the entirety of that time. For solar and wind, the cost structure is different, right? Like you basically pay the upfront cost to install the solar panel or put up the wind turbine. But once you've done that, the costs of running it are extremely low. You're not buying any fuel, right? The fuel is free, right? So the costs are very front loaded. And for some countries, they can basically take on that cost and pay that upfront cost. But it's in particular for lower income countries, the capital costs are just a barrier because lower income countries just don't have that much capital to spend. And often they can get some financing from like these kind of larger like international banks or even higher income countries as a loan. But often the conditions of that loan are pretty poor because they're considered like risky bets. And I actually don't think they're risky bets. And a lot of the data suggests that the payback is not any worse than you would get elsewhere, but they are often still considered risky bets. And then I think the final thing that is the key barrier is that we always think about and focus on the putting up the solar panel or putting up the wind turbine. Really key barrier that many countries are experiencing at the moment is actually about the grid system as a whole. So you don't just need to put up the renewable energy plant, you also need to be able to connect it to the grid. At the moment, many countries have pretty old grid systems, and the grid system is basically the entirety of the pylons and the interconnectors that transport energy from where it's produced to our houses, our offices, where it's needed, right? And that's this really intricate, balanced system. And the issue we're often having at the moment is these systems are old and we're trying to add lots of little power plants at the same time. And there's a lot of protection over that system because there's often a high risk that it become unstable, right? So often the key barrier is this really long queues of renewable energy projects that want to get built and actually have finance to get built, but they're waiting years to get a grid connection and get connected to the grid. So actually I think that's the biggest barrier for many countries at the moment.
And is there a solution there that you think would help speed that process up? Is that something that you've thought about?
There's like very policy wonk solutions to this, where a lot of it is basically reforming a lot of the permitting process, where in the past, basically countries have set up permitting and approval systems for their grids, where for fossil fuels, where you have like a really small number of big plants, right? And that's the system that we've had in the past. And we're in this kind of uncomfortable stage where we're trying to transition, but that permitting and kind of policy system is not necessarily caught up yet. So I think there is reform there that's needed to speed this up. The UK is another key example where I think they're now making positive changes, where in the past they had this queue that was forming was on a first come, first served basis, right? And the issue there is that the projects in the queue were at very, very different levels of development and seriousness, right? So we could both say, Simon, I'm going to build a solar plant, and you could say, I'm going to build a wind plant, but you're really, really serious about that and you're ready to go. Whereas I've just kind of have this pipe dream, not really like that being that serious. But if I get in the queue first, you're waiting for a long time and I get served first, even though the reality is that I'm probably not going to build that power plant in the end. So they're switching from this first come, first serve to basically this merit-based system where they're basically trying to pick the best projects that have most likely to go through and would produce the most energy and provide the most benefit.
And then thinking about the kind of developing countries where you mentioned that some of them just don't have the funds, the upfront costs to kind of deploy renewable energy solutions. What level of responsibility do wealthier countries like the UK, Australia, US have? What degree of duty of care do we have in helping these countries fund renewable energy solutions so they don't go down the fossil fuel path that we've gone down?
So I think that's more of a moral question than an empirical question, but I also just have a moral take on this, which I think we do have a responsibility. I think richer countries have disproportionately created this problem, and it's not necessarily a deliberate creation, right? Like, this goes back many generations, and we've been burning fossil fuels for more than a century now. Not necessarily because we wanted to drive climate change, and we often didn't have, our ancestors didn't have necessarily other options, but the reality is that we have generated a large amount of warming and now benefit from the lifestyle that development has given us. And the issue is that we did all this before there was climate agreements and pressure on countries to reduce emissions and not to use fossil fuels. And then you have many countries today where large amounts of the population are living in energy poverty and extremely poor standards of living, and they just want the quality of life that we have. And there's now pressure on them to somehow do that in a way that they also just never use fossil fuels and don't generate any carbon, right? Which is very different from the development pathway that countries like the UK or the US followed. So I think we do have some responsibility to where we can help those countries skip the fossil fuel phase. One, because of the kind of climate change issue, but also because I think there are huge development benefits for those countries in basically skipping that whole fossil fuel phase. So I think there are all additional benefits from that moving forward. So I think there is responsibility there. What I would say is that I think the country that's arguably contributing the most in a positive way to this is China, where if you look especially over the last years, and this really great group called Ember now tracks exports of solar panels and other clean tech from China, and China's producing huge amounts and exporting huge amounts. Over the last year in particular, you've seen a huge uptake in exports of these technologies to countries like Pakistan has been a big one, and now many countries across sub-Saharan Africa. And the reason is because China is producing these technologies incredibly cheaply and is making it really, really accessible for these countries to adopt these technologies at a much, much lower rate. I think is a huge positive contribution.
Yeah, that might come as a surprise to people, because I think the general view out there is that China is one of the countries that's doing the most damage to the environment.
Yeah, like I think at the moment China is often framed as, at least in the kind of climate space, as this kind of climate paradox, where on the one hand it is the world's largest emitter. It emits around a third of the world's carbon emissions. You often will see headlines about China still building new coal plants, and it is still building new coal plants. But at the same time, domestically in China, it's deploying clean energy at really rapid rates. Like, the rollout of solar and wind and batteries there is incredible. The speed of uptake of electric cars is really, really rapid. So last year, over half of new cars sold in China were electric. So it's moving really fast domestically, but it's also hugely dominating global supply chains and production of these. One, the minerals needed for these products, and two, the actual products themselves. So it's also just exporting huge amounts of this. And I think this really exemplifies the difference in the narrative maybe that some countries like the UK or the US have towards climate change and solutions, and the approach that China is taking. Like, China clearly sees this energy transition as an opportunity for them, one, domestically, to move away from fossil fuels and reduce energy insecurity from having to import fossil fuels. It basically wants to be kind of energy independent domestically. But it's also just seen a huge opportunity that it can just dominate these new markets and these new technologies. And I think that's quite different from the narrative, at least we have in the UK, where this energy transition and addressing climate change is kind of seen as this sacrifice that we'll have to do. So I think the contrast in the narrative and approaches there is quite interesting and important.
Yeah, that seems like an important reframe, and very critical to the speed at which all of these things are rolled out, because like, certainly, and I've had this pushback from people before, that it would seem that a lot of these solutions, there's a trade-off with economical growth, but what you're saying is that there isn't necessarily a trade-off, and there is in fact an opportunity for economic growth while transitioning to solutions that are better for the environment.
Yeah, I think if we look historically, especially over the last few decades, There are examples of a large number of countries that have, one, managed to grow their economies while also reducing their carbon emissions at the same time. And the UK is an example, the US is an example, most countries in Europe are examples where you've seen what we call this decoupling of GDP or economic growth from carbon emissions. So this decoupling is more than possible. The speed is still up for debate and whether we can do this fast enough. But then there's another lens to this, which is kind of China's situation, where it's not just that you're able to reduce emissions and grow your economy at the same time, or at least these don't have negative impacts on one another, but that actually the transition itself generates economic growth, and producing the products and technologies that countries need to do this generates economic growth. And that's the reality in China. Like, clean energy production and the sales of these products was actually a substantial percentage of their overall economic growth in the last few years.
Whether you're training hard or simply aiming to feel your best every day, IM8 Daily Ultimate Essentials has you covered. It's the daily multi-nutrient that I've recently switched to and now recommend. With 92 bioavailable nutrients, including vitamin B12, vitamin D, iodine, choline, K2, CoQ10 for heart health, and MSM for joint recovery. It is NSF certified for sport. It ships to over 30 countries, including the United States, Canada, the UK, Australia, and New Zealand, and works with both plant-based and omnivorous diets. I've used several multi-nutrients over the years, but IM8's clean formulation and commitment to science and clinical validation really stood out. So much so that I've joined their scientific advisory board alongside Dr. David Katz and Dr. Suzanne Devkota, two previous guests of The Proof. For listeners of The Proof, IM8 is offering 10% off your first daily Ultimate Essentials order with the code SIMON at checkout. Just head to im8health.com. That's IM, the number 8, HEALTH.com, and use promo code SIMON to get started. What have you learned about the use of AI and the energy demands of that? This area is exploding. I think probably the majority of listeners of this show are using ChatGPT or Claude or Notebook LM, all of these different AI tools. How kind of energy intensive are they? And do you see AI as more of a climate problem or part of the solution?
Mixed. I think it is a challenge, is an additional energy and climate challenge that we're going to have to face over the next few decades. I don't see it as this deal breaker or this reason that we somehow cannot solve this problem, or that we need to stop using AI entirely in order to address the climate change problem. But at least the direct emissions from having to generate energy to power data centers for AI will increase over time. But the data on this is quite interesting, because I think we often talk about AI as this huge explosion and so energy hungry and uses so much energy. And when you actually look at some of the data on this, I think when people think about AI, they think about these kind of LLMs like ChatGPT or Gemini, etc. When you look at the individual electricity use of a single query, so asking ChatGPT a question, the energy footprint and carbon emissions from that are actually pretty low, and actually I think surprisingly low for many people. So the general, numbers are converging somewhere around 0.3 to 3 watt hours, and that's a unit of energy. But to give context for how big that is, that's basically like watching TV for 9 seconds, or using a microwave for 1 second, or using a fridge for 6 seconds or something. The amount of energy used for an individual query is extremely, extremely low. And for most people will be a really, really tiny fraction of their energy footprint and their carbon footprint.
So it's not going to be comparable to most people's diet, even if you're using AI regularly throughout the day, every day.
Even if you're doing tens or hundreds of queries, text-based queries on ChatGPT or another provider every day, are still tiny compared to impacts like your diet or if you drive, driving, or aircon, or heat pumps if you heat your home. It's really small compared to these big activities that dominate your footprint. Obviously, the impact of one individual query is small, but that doesn't necessarily mean that the aggregate impact of all the queries and all of the AI use is small. That is substantial. I think still lower than many people imagine, but it does add up. So to give some context, data centers, which is not just AI is actually currently a relatively small amount of data centers. Data centers is basically everything that's used for our digital services pre-AI as well, is a few % of the world's electricity. So then AI is a fraction of that. So you're talking about less than 1%, maybe 0.5% or a bit lower of total global electricity use. So by no means is this kind of completely dominating our electricity system or our carbon emissions, but it is growing fairly rapidly. I would say the main challenge with AI in energy is that globally lots of people use it, but it's very, very highly concentrated in where this is produced, right? So data centers are not spread all over the world, and every city has them or every town has them, like how other energy sources are dissipated. Data centers tend to be very, very highly concentrated. And what that means generally is that you're taking all of the world's demand for AI and you're forcing that on a really, really small number of locations. And that can still create local instability in the grid and higher prices and pressures on that local system, even if the global amount of electricity we're using is way less than 1% of global electricity. So it's often a very localized, concentrated problem, rather than the fact that every country in the world has seen this rapid rise in electricity use from AI.
So we might need to spread those data centers out a bit more over time.
Yeah.
I'm living in Los Angeles currently, and one of the decisions that I'm thinking about is whether or not I'll get a car. I've been here for a little while now, and I don't have a car at the moment. I generally book an Uber when I need to get somewhere that's far away, or just ride my bike locally. And in this decision kind of making process, I've been thinking about, should I buy a secondhand car in America? Like a classic car, like an old Porsche. I love old Porsches. Or should I buy a new electric car, like a Rivian? And I'd like to get your view on this, is from an environmental perspective, what is a better choice, to kind of recycle or upcycle a car that has already been produced but is a petrol car, versus purchasing a brand new car that requires manufacturing but is electric?
So I always start this answer by saying the best thing you can do environmentally is to not have a car, right? I always need to give that caveat, and then lead on to the decision. If someone decides that they do need a car, then what is the best choice? My recommendation would be to get a second-hand electric car, because that avoids the dilemma. So a second-hand electric car would obviously be the best choice from a carbon perspective. But if you want to frame it as a new electric car versus a second-hand petrol or gas car, I would generally say that the new electric car is better for the environment. Now, there are emissions in two ways that come from getting a car. One is the emissions generated from producing and manufacturing that car in the first place, and then there's emissions from driving and running it and basically burning the oil. Now, if you take an electric car and a petrol car, the emissions associated with first producing that car are higher for the electric car, right? So if you took these two cars and no one ever drove anywhere, the emissions from the electric car would be higher. But once you start driving, that carbon debt very, very quickly pays off, right? So then the emissions from running the gas car are much higher. And if you take a new electric car versus a new petrol car, it would generally pay back or become even after around 1 to 2 years, right? So after 1 to 2 years, your electric car then becomes better, and from there it just becomes increasingly better than the petrol car over time. If you were to take a new electric car versus a second-hand car, of course you don't have the additional emissions from producing the petrol car, but you're only really adding on an extra year of payback time for electric cars. So rather than it being 1 to 2 years payback time, it might be 2 to 3 years payback time. But if you are going to drive that car for some substantial amount of time, or even then sell it and pass it on to another person in the market, you would generally pay that back. So I would still recommend to get the electric car over the second-hand petrol car.
Good to know. A common critique of electric vehicles that comes up is about the sustainability of the batteries. So the mining of lithium and cobalt and nickel, and what happens to the batteries at the end of their life. From your perspective, how much of a concern is that? Is it valid, and how much is it kind of overstated compared to alternatives?
I think these concerns are always valid. I think there are two, I get these questions a lot, and I think there are two dimensions to this. I think the one, before you even get to the end of their life and the recycling, I think there are valid concerns about the environmental impacts, but also the human exploitation impacts of mining some of these minerals. And the one that always comes to mind is cobalt. So most of the world's cobalt is mined in the Democratic Republic of Congo. Often the working conditions there are incredibly poor. There are reports of child labour. The wages or salary paid for people working there basically all day in these really pretty dangerous mining conditions are incredibly low. You're talking about a few dollars a day. It's really pretty dire and exploitative. And there are historically these lithium-ion batteries that are still in many electric cars, but especially many of the earlier models of electric cars do contain cobalt. What's important to note there, I think, is that these lithium-ion batteries we have been using for many decades in basically all of our personal technology products. So mobile phones, laptops, Kindles, e-readers, iPads, like any of the kind of handheld technology devices we have, the batteries in them have cobalt in them, and that cobalt has probably been mined from the Democratic Republic of Congo. So this notion that this issue is suddenly just arrived because of electric cars or batteries for grid storage is wrong. This has been a problem for a long period of time, just an ignored problem. But there is a solution to this, especially for cobalt, which is that many of the chemistries that are now being used in batteries do not contain any cobalt, right? So many, especially, I always bring up Tesla, but the chemistry of the batteries used in most Tesla cars today do not contain cobalt. And I think many manufacturers will start to move to chemistries that don't contain cobalt. Lithium is another mineral that people are concerned about, I think quite validly. Again, there are alternative battery chemistries that don't use any lithium, right? So we don't just avoid the cobalt, but we can also avoid the lithium. So many Chinese battery manufacturers now are experimenting with sodium-ion battery chemistries. And sodium, we have loads of sodium, so that's not a concern, and that avoids cobalt and lithium. So I think there are alternative chemistries that we can use for the batteries that avoid some of these issues. And then once batteries get towards the end of their life, we do want to recycle these materials and these minerals. Like part of the advantages of the system, as we described earlier, fossil fuels are not renewable, and once you burn them, that's it, gone. We don't want to create that with what we're building with renewable energy, where we just use the minerals once and then throw them away. We want to be able to upcycle and reuse them. And there, I think there are technology developments in terms of recycling many of these chemistries. And I think for most of the minerals, and this gets better over time, we will be able to use and reuse these minerals at the end of their life in batteries. There's often this kind of statistic floating around that only 5% of lithium-ion batteries are recycled. I think that's become a bit of a zombie statistic, where I don't actually think that's true, and I think the percentage is higher. And I think as this technology develops, I think that will increase further. So I don't think we're going to have all of our batteries and electric cars just going to landfill with the minerals in them.
And just to be clear, the kind of comparison you made earlier, an electric vehicle versus a petrol car, you said the electric vehicle will require more emissions to produce, but by about a couple of years in, because there's less emissions associated with it's running it becomes advantageous from a greenhouse gas emissions point of view. And then over time there, it just gets exponentially better. Is that calculation based on charging an electric vehicle with electricity that's coming from the burning of fossil fuels? Or is that based on charging an electric vehicle using electricity that's generated from solar or wind or some other type of renewable energy?
So it's partly based on a mix that uses fossil fuels. So the numbers I gave there are kind of approximations for the UK, where we don't have any coal anymore, but we still burn a lot of gas, even though we have growing renewables. So it's a mix of fossil fuels and renewables. The payback time will vary a bit depending on, as you say, the amount of fossil fuels and renewables and nuclear energy that you have in the mix. So it varies a bit, but not hugely dramatically, especially if you're talking about somewhere in the US or somewhere in Europe where this energy transition is happening. If you were to power it entirely from renewables, the payback period would be much less than a year, right? And I think that's the key point that many people are not seeing, is that at the same time as we're rolling out electric vehicles, we're also decarbonising or making our electricity grids cleaner at the same time, right? So the emissions or the positive impact from getting an electric car will just improve over time, right? So your emissions in 5 years or 10 years will be even better than the conditions we have today. If you are, one question that often comes up is, but what about in India or China where they just burn huge amounts of coal? Like, surely that can't be better than driving a petrol car. And even if you have quite a lot of coal in your electricity mix, that's still better than the petrol car per mile driven. The difference in emissions is much less than if you're in the UK, for example, where we have no coal and our grid is much cleaner, but it's still better than a petrol car. It's just that your payback time will be higher than 2 years if you're basically powering it by coal.
And it's nice to know that companies like Tesla and other companies are shifting away from cobalt or not using cobalt in their batteries, because I remember reading, I think it was Cobalt Red. I'm not sure if you've read that book, but I do remember reading that book and personally feeling pretty guilty for like purchasing an iPhone. It gave me reason to pause, and it has affected the cadence or the frequency in which I buy an iPhone now.
Yeah, no, like I also read that book and it was really impactful. I think one thing I'd say on that is that the cobalt is a problem, and I think the fact that it's very exploitative is not up for debate. Like, I think the evidence of that is very clear. But when we're thinking about solutions, for people or miners in the Democratic Republic of Congo, purely taking the technology route of just not using cobalt at all and switching away from it is maybe not the absolute best outcome for them, right? So the better outcome from them would actually be that we just improve working conditions in the Democratic Republic of Congo and they get paid more money for it and get paid fairly for it, and they don't have to send kids into the mine to contribute. That would require much more social, economic, political change than just simply switching a technology, which is why the world is going down the technology route. But for miners in the Democratic Republic of Congo, like, they're often living in a very extreme poverty. They don't have many working opportunities to lift themselves out of poverty. And the mining aspect is maybe the only opportunity they have just to stay above the line and just to survive, right? And if we take that out, then they might actually be in more dire consequences than currently.
Yeah, that's true. And it would be great to have companies like Apple or whoever it is are utilizing cobalt as part of their supply chain. Again, it comes back to duty of care. Because it would be great if, as an individual, I didn't have to think about the cadence or frequency in which I'm buying it, because the companies in Western countries that are utilizing cobalt are working on human rights issues like what you're talking about. And maybe they are, maybe I'm just not aware of that. But I think that if that industry is to be maintained, and we've acknowledged as a human rights issue, then there is a duty of care for companies that are going to continue to utilize that resource in their supply chain.
Recently, I looked at some of Apple's environmental reports, and they actually report that now in iPhones they use, I think it was iPhones, or maybe it's another product, but I think it was iPhones, they basically just use recycled cobalt now. So I'm actually not sure that they are using raw new cobalt that's being mined. So I think there are some companies in this area that are starting to make that shift, which I think is positive. I just wish there was a way to also support miners in countries like the DRC to be able to take economic advantage of this resource that they have, rather than completely switching away to an alternative.
Yeah, totally. I agree. That makes sense. What about another form of transport here, flying? How important is decarbonizing the aviation industry, and where are we at with that?
I think it's important. I think often the paradox for people is that for individuals that fly, it's one of the biggest, if not the biggest, single part of their carbon footprint, right? So a return flight from Europe to the US, for example, you're talking about several tons of CO2 emitted per person, and that's just for a single flight.
Hannah, just to put that into context, how would that compare to someone's annual greenhouse gas emissions from their diet?
So probably the average emissions from someone's diet is about 2 tons, maybe. So you're talking probably comparable. So maybe a
One
flight.
Wow.
Maybe a return flight, I would say. I think in my head I have the numbers that if you were to switch from a kind of moderate meat-based diet to a plant-based diet, you're probably talking about a saving of 1 to 2 tons. But that return flight is also about 1 to 2 tons. So if you fly a lot, that's often not necessarily cancelling out, but it's very large relative to other parts of your carbon footprint. So there's this paradox where for individuals that fly a lot, it's a huge part of their carbon footprint. But globally, when we look at its contribution to total emissions, it's somewhere in the range of 2 to 3%, right? And there are slightly higher warming impact of flying, and that's for complex reasons, but emits water vapor at high in the sky at altitude, and that also has an additional warming impact. So the warming impact of aviation as a total is maybe something like 3.5%. But I think it's smaller than people might imagine. I think people would imagine that it's, 10% or 20%, like a huge part of global emissions. So it's still relatively substantial, and it's still something that we need to address. But I think it's arguably one of the sectors that is going to be the most difficult. We can't just switch to batteries like we can for road transport. We can't just switch to solar power like we can for the electricity grid. There are a couple of solutions to decarbonize flying. They each have their downsides. And currently I don't think there's a clear winner on what that alternative fuel source is going to be. So one option is biofuels. You could use biofuels instead of jet fuel. The huge downside there is the amount of land that we would need in order to produce that amount of biofuel for the world's flights. So that's the major downside there.
And that would be something like soybean or something like that. Is that what you mean by biofuel?
Yeah, so some of the kind of leading contenders there. One, there was the very kind of high-profile Virgin Atlantic transatlantic flight that flew based on kind of waste oils and fats. And that made the headlines and it was a big splash. The issue with that is that we just don't have anywhere near enough waste oil and fats in the world. Even if you took all of it, I think it's something like 5 to 10% of the world's aviation demand if you could use all of that oils and fats. So that's not going to be the solution, even if it's a part of it. You could use other vegetable oils, like you could use something like soybean oil, or you could even use palm oil. I guess that's an option.
Oh, Hannah, I can see the headlines now. Seed oils and vegetable oils using as fuel to fuel United and Virgin. It's pretty ironic.
So you could use vegetable oils. You could use cereal crops. Like currently, countries like the US produce huge amounts of corn, and they currently put that into cars. You could put that in a plane in the same way. But for all of these, the downside is the amount of land that you would need. And the amount of land that you would need has some offsetting impact on the carbon savings that you'd get, right? So there are like some calculations that actually using biofuels, if you take in to account the land use and the carbon opportunity costs of that are actually not better than using the jet fuel itself. So that's the major downside. There are options like hydrogen for flying. The main issue with hydrogen is that we basically would use electricity to produce hydrogen and use it as a fuel. But you would need quite a lot of electricity in order to produce that. And of course, that just increases the demand for electricity that we would need. So I think it's something like, in order to power the world's planes by hydrogen, we would need to increase global electricity production by around 20% or something like that. And we're already having to add a lot to our electricity demand. So we're electrifying electric vehicles and some of our industry and heating and artificial intelligence. And so this is all racking up. And then you would maybe stick aviation on top, which adds another part in pressure onto that. So there are options for aviation with their downsides, but I don't think there's a very, very clear winner at the moment.
I imagine consumers would probably feel more comfortable shifting to a hybrid energy source plane than a fully electric plane, at least at the beginning.
Battery technology is progressing rapidly, and I think that short-haul flights could feasibly be done all electric. Long-haul flights, I think we're like a very, very far from that, and I would be skeptical that we would get there. But short-haul flights and short-haul shipping, I think, could be electrified, but it's the long-haul stuff that we would need these alternatives for.
Yeah, this topic of aviation makes me personally, speaking candidly here, feel quite guilty, because from a diet perspective, I have a very low greenhouse gas footprint. That's undeniable. But I fly back to Australia, a couple times a year. So quite quickly, I'm offsetting any reduction I'm getting from my diet. And this is why I don't put myself on a pedestal and don't like to preach about my greenhouse gas footprint of my diet, because I'm absolutely sure that my personal footprint is greater than many people who eat meat-heavy diets. How should I be feeling about that? Should as an individual, should I be feeling guilty that my transportation is resulting in a large amount of greenhouse gas emissions to fly back home to Australia to visit family and those sorts of things?
I don't think you should feel guilty. And I think with any of these choices, I don't think it's even a very productive emotion to feel guilty. I think some people would argue that guilt is actually helpful because it forces people or shames them into making change. I'm not that convinced by that argument. I think often guilt is just an emotion that people then kind of struggle through with, but actually doesn't necessarily drive change in a positive way. So I wouldn't feel guilty about it. I think the reality is for many people, flying is just this uncomfortable. If they're kind of climate conscious, it is this kind of uncomfortable part of their footprint, because we don't currently have good alternatives for long haul flying. And some people do. The reality is some people do just have to travel. It's not necessarily that they're flying on holiday all the time. They are maybe forced to fly because they have a work trip, or their family lives on the other side of the world and they have to fly to visit their family. So for some people, this is just unavoidable, and the reality is that there are no viable alternatives to this. I think my answer might be different if you were in the UK and you were deciding to fly from Edinburgh to London, because there are alternatives. You could take the train, right? But the reality of the position you're in is that you don't necessarily have an alternative in all of these scenarios.
Yeah, I could hop on a ship, but it'd take me a month. This, I guess, brings us, and we close out here, to this conversation that we may have with ourselves or with others about who's responsible for these climate solutions. And many of these problems we have inherited. We're born into a world where there were certain systems in place. How much of solving climate change is really up to the individual versus our governments?
So I think this is often framed as a kind of false dichotomy, where there's one crowd that would say this is all about individual change and we all just have to do our bit, and if we all just do our bit, this problem will be solved. And I think that's wrong. I think if we all just do a little bit, we'll achieve a little bit, but we're not going to solve this problem by individuals simply changing behaviours. Often because they don't have the resources or the money, or it's not viable in their kind of life conditions in order to make that change. But also it needs that broader environment to make those options, those better options available to them. So I think the kind of just individual behaviour change is going to solve that is wrong. I also think the notion that this is just purely a systemic problem and it's just on governments and greedy businesses and banks to fix this, and individuals don't have any role to play at all. I think that's also wrong. Like, the reality is it's both, right? So governments, businesses, financial institutions, this more systemic lens is absolutely crucial. And it's absolutely crucial because in order for individuals to make better choices and make that switch, they need public transport to be available. They need electric charging networks. They need cheap electric cars that they can afford, or train tickets that they can afford. They maybe need plant-based meat substitutes that companies need to innovate on and produce. So they need that systemic change to make the options available and cheap and, I guess, easy or viable for them to adopt. But at the same time, governments, companies, funders are not going to put the policies in place or invest or generate products if you have a public that's not willing to change at all. We can't expect the governments to put out elaborate electric charging network and companies to create amazing electric cars if all of us say, I don't like electric cars, I'm going to stick with a petrol one. That just clearly doesn't work, right? So you need both dimensions where the systemic change makes it available for people to make the more positive change. But individuals, of course, need to be willing to make that change when the option is there.
And there's something at an individual level to be said about living in integrity. So if you are committed to helping improve the environment and the climate, it would seem like just at a very basic level, the filter, at least how I try and think about this, is on a choice-by-choice basis, which we have every day. Is there a better choice that's available to me within my means? And that helps that factors in the inequality that exists in the world, because often the better choice for me is not available to someone else across the pond, and it would be unfair to assume so. But at an individual level, when you have that alignment and you feel that level of integrity, that's something I believe that our body does kind of keep the score of. And life does feel better and more peaceful when we're making decisions that are aligned with our values and beliefs. So I certainly agree with you. I think responsibility is shared at the individual level and at the government level. Hannah, this has been incredible, so informative as always, a wealth of knowledge, and you do such a great job communicating very complex and difficult questions and answers to people. Was there anything that you wanted to talk about today that we missed, or anything that we covered that you wanted to kind of add to here at the end?
I think it was just great. It was very wide ranging, which I love. I think just to pick up on that final point on individual change, I completely agree with the integrity point. I think many people have this sense that what they do just will never make a difference, or like their total impact is very, very tiny. So what's the point? I think it's also important to recognize that the changes we make can often have very positive spillovers. And this comes back to this acknowledging people's capacity and resources to make better choices. For some people, they just can't choose the low carbon choice at the moment because it's too expensive or it's not available where they are. But what's really, really key about many of these solutions and technologies is that as more people adopt them and they grow in scale globally, they become more available for other people. And they become more available for other people because they get cheaper, or because governments can see that demand is rising, so they invest more, or companies see that there's a market for this, so they come in, and that creates competition, and that creates better products and cheaper products. And that's really key. So many of these solutions, the earliest adopters are basically rich people in rich countries, because they can afford the expensive electric vehicle when it was expensive. They can afford maybe even the plant-based meat substitute products that were expensive. But what you generally see is that they tend to fall in price over time as more and more people adopt them. And what that means is that they become more and more available to people maybe further down the income distribution or in areas that don't have these products. So over time, the impact of those individual choices grow and can make a difference for people that are maybe in different circumstances from you or I.
So some power in being an early adopter.
Definitely, yeah.
Great. Thank you so much, Hannah. I'll pop a link to your new book, Clearing the Air, A Hopeful Guide to Solving Climate Change in 50 Questions and Answers, into the show notes. Where else can we send people so they can find you online and read everything that you're publishing?
So I guess if you're interested in data on environment, but much broader than that, then I would send people to Our World in Data. Hopefully you find interesting stuff there. And then I have a Substack called Sustainability by Numbers, where I basically look at the data and break down the data on like many of the questions that we've been discussing today, and taking questions about like the kind of question framing of the book, taking questions that people have and trying to provide context on what the latest data says on mining or electric vehicles or any other kind of solutions-based questions that people have on these topics.
Brilliant. Thank you, Hannah. Thank you so much for your contribution to this space, and thank you for hanging out with us again.
Thanks very much, Simon. Really enjoyed it.
There you have it, friends. I hope you enjoyed this episode. If you did and want to stay up to date with future episodes, be sure to hit that subscribe button on YouTube and follow on Apple or Spotify. Finally, thank you for showing up and the effort that you're making to take control of your health. I look forward to hanging out with you again in the next episode.